I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, this is something which in your lifetime and mine is going to be a colossal issue.
This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far.
Breaking up into these sort of mini national states within the United Kingdom, I think, would be a disaster.
And you would leave believing that the rest of the planet lived in Eden until the wicked Europeans arrive. It's not education, it's self-flagellation.
Murray expresses concern for the UK's future in these uncertain times.
There'll be a monarchy. I would worry about the United Kingdom in these circumstances. As you say, Piers, I mean, the gains that Sinn Féin made in the local elections, historic gains, should be troubling to anyone who is, like me, a unionist.
Sinn Féin, though an Irish nationalist party, is seen by Murray as extremist.
Sinn Féin, of course, is an Irish nationalist party and is, as well, in my own view, an extremist party. And that isn't mere rhetoric. You know, Mary Lou MacDonald, the head of Sinn Féin, has an unbelievable track record.
Sinn Féin has always shown respect to statues in Dublin.
You mentioned this earlier. You know, there's only one statue in Europe, and it sits in the park in Dublin. Sean Russell, an IRA member who was on a German U-boat in 1940. There's a statue here in Dublin, and Sinn Féin always pay their respects there.
Mary Lou MacDonald represents the more militant faction of Sinn Féin.
Mary Lou MacDonald, a couple of years ago, was taken there to pay her respect. She was, as it were, bloodied by the more militant wings of Sinn Féin. That's totally normal in Sinn Féin history.
Sinn Féin are not just nationalists, they are extreme Irish nationalists.
It's not just that they were an extremist party in the past, it's that they are in the present. It's not just that they're Irish nationalists, that they are actually extreme Irish nationalists, violent Irish nationalists, always have been, and seem to continue to be. I think it's an incredibly worrying development. As you say, alongside the ongoing success electorally of the Scots nationalists in
Murray warns the breakup of our country is a real possibility.
It's certainly possible we could see the breakup of our country. It's something where I think everyone who recognizes that the United Kingdom's been an enormous force for good in the world should really be very worried about. We should be very troubled by that. You know, the breaking up into these sort of mini national states within the United Kingdom, I think, would be a disaster. Yeah. And you're right, one other thing quickly, of course, Her Majesty the Queen has presided over this period of peace and union, and I worry enormously about what comes after, as everyone does. They basically find him guilty of some Victorian attitudes, which, as you know, if you're born in Victorian England, you might well have some Victorian attitudes. Surprise, surprise. If you're born in the 19th century, it turns out you don't have all of 2022's views. But you're right, I mean, the anti-Westernists, which is what I think they are, not just woke. Woke's a sort of manifestation of it, but the people who just hate the West, hate the Western democracies, they keep trying to take down our hero figures. When I first started noticing, I thought, this is very strange. You know, normally cultural revolution, we start at the margins and move inwards, but they haven't, and I think that this is very telling. They have come for Winston Churchill and are defaming his reputation, and this isn't just the fringes, this isn't just some protesters graffitiing his statues.
In America, historical guilt is used to justify the removal of statues.
It's things like the BBC, who now never run a story about Churchill without running a link to a page of the 10 worst of Winston Churchill. We have the college named after him at Cambridge, running panels about his alleged racism and much more. And when I noticed this, I thought, this is strange. And then I looked at America, and it's the same thing. In America, the same thing of finding people guilty of being born in the past and having some attitudes of the past has been used to justify the removals of statues of the founding
the lowest
fathers,
moment for me,
Abraham
Douglas,
Lincoln.
I thought the worst moment for me was when you had the Black Lives Matter protests in London, and they had to board up the statues in Parliament Square of Churchill, Mandela and Gandhi. Three of the great figures, really, of the last 100 years, had to be protected from a mob that may want to deface them and scrawl horrible graffiti on them. And I thought that was such a depressing moment.
Nobody passes this test, Piers. That's the crucial thing. Nobody passes the test You know, as I say in The War on the West, you know, even if you take some of the criticisms of Churchill, and like all people, he's a bit flawed. Everybody is. But even if you take those criticisms, you know, does standing alone against and being more important than any other individual for seeing and beaten back, does that count for nothing?
Yeah.
You know, so what if he liked to drink on the side? So what if he said some things that we don't agree with today? That should count in the plus side. Same thing with Abraham Lincoln. Does freeing the count for nothing? Apparently not now. Abraham Lincoln in America has the same treatment. At the point, even Gandhi, who you just mentioned, gets the same treatment. Nobody is good enough for these people who believe that history starts with them and only they, in 2022, know what's right and wrong. These people, of course, are doing something very, very wicked, very quickly. They know that if they take out Churchill, they will take out Britishness at a very fundamental level. They take out Jefferson and Lincoln, they've taken out America.
Murray observes that UK museums are filled with self-condemnations.
And I discovered on returning this week that it's now become an oddity of our own time. The museum is filled with condemnations of the museum. The collection is filled with condemnations of the collection. Almost everything tells you about the sins of European colonialism, European racism. There are, of course, all of the nods to the religion of our time. There are segments on Beyond the Binary, because I'm sure that's what everybody wants when they go to the Pitt Rivers collection. And we see, for instance, anime characters from the 1990s who are strong queer icons. My point is that the museum is effectively abolishing itself. It's saying that the collection was put together by bad forces and it has to be saved in the modern era, reinterpreted and indeed accused. Now this, as I say in my cover piece this week, is not at all unusual. It is something that is going on at collection after collection and museum after museum across the land. And the oddity of this is not just that this is in fact encouraged by, for instance, the Museums Association, which tells collections in the UK how to, quote, decolonize, but of course that the collections themselves are doing it. We just saw last weekend the Wellcome Collection on London's Euston Road announcing that it was closing its exhibition. Why? Because it had tried to decolonize, but it couldn't tear itself away from its white male origins. And so the Wellcome Collection announced that it would be closing. It couldn't justify itself, so in the end, it stopped.
Criticism is acceptable, provided it's not a one-sided political attack.
What I think is strange is that they should hate the collections which they are in charge of. Again, I come back to the point, I followed, unlike Ed, extremely closely the activities of the Tate in recent years, and also observed extremely closely the way in which they decided to make Stanley Spencer, one of the other two great artists of the 20th century, in their collection, into a posthumous racist for no good reason at all. So yes, that's what I find strange. But to get back to your point, Kate, the interesting thing about this word retain and explain thing is it's absolutely fine and admirable so long as it isn't a one-directional political hit job. And let me give you an example of what a one-directional political hit job looks like. If you want to, for instance, say parts of this museum were put together in an era of colonialism in Europe or colonialism in Britain, fine. Who doesn't mind that? I don't mind that. I don't think anyone would mind that. But here's what I mind. Is when you, for instance, as at the Pitt Rivers, get that, and then a strange silence on everywhere else in the world. For instance, the Kingdom of Benin, which has already come up a couple of times. If you stand before the display on the Kingdom of Benin in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, do you learn anything about... Curiously enough, no. Do you learn that the Kingdom of Benin was practicing long after the British Empire decided to abolish it and sent its ships across the seas trying to stamp it out anywhere else? No. And you would leave believing that the rest of the planet lived in Eden until the wicked Europeans arrived. It's not education, it's self-flagellation.
Brexit was the result of a 25-year campaign against globalist elites.
Well, we had really a massive...
What do you think a Labour government will do to the UK?
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer has no leadership qualities whatsoever. He is devoid of any sort of charisma at all. And people do need a leader, you know, that inspires them to a certain degree. He's kind of doing well because he's not the Conservatives and there is revulsion. There is There is revulsion at them, a sense of betrayal about them. On the face of it, his manifesto on climate change is almost identical to the Conservatives. His manifesto on economics is almost identical to the Conservatives. But I think we know that what we'll see is trans ideology in the ascendancy. We'll see more legislation designed to divide us up into different groups rather than bring us together as human beings equal before the law. I look at his potential front bench of the top ministers. I see very little competence whatsoever. He's almost going to win by default, as opposed to, a big enthusiastic wave of support. And so in some ways, I think there's every opportunity for this just to be a one-term Labour government. There'll be no honeymoon. There'll be no sort of after-victory glow. He faces a big set of problems. The ones I mentioned earlier, the population explosion, the fact our public services don't work, the fact young people can't get a house and even their rents take up over half of their income. And he won't have the solutions to any of it. He's campaigning on a slogan of change, but actually it'll be more of the same, just ever so slightly worse. So here's the opportunity. The opportunity is to reshape the centre-right of British politics, to be where the silent majority actually are. Now, I know that the British Conservative Party has been around for 190 years, but nothing necessarily lasts forever. And what I'm doing with Reform UK is I am taking those stances on all of those issues that I think give us the kind of radical change that we need. And I use the word radical in an old-fashioned sense of the word. You see, I'm a traditionalist. I think that our culture matters.
Douglas Murray is captivated by the utopian dreams that abound.
And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for.
He believes it's not simply about good versus bad.
One of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad, I'm a good person, you're a Nazi, it's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues.
Mercy and justice are the virtues vying for dominance in this debate.
There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that.
We must ensure justice for those seeking refuge in new lands.
But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. We can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here.
There are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this.
And this is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this.
Murray gives 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have.
So let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others.
As you say, this is in 2015, the Swedes opened their borders. They said it's incredibly important to be open-hearted and generous to the world and so on. But what they did was, as we just heard in the previous segment, they did what a lot of governments have been doing. You effectively punish people who come to our countries legally. You punish them and you incentivize people who break the rules and come illegally. And that's happening everywhere from Sweden to America to Britain and Australia. It's an astonishing mistake. But yes, I mean, as Rita says, you know, you have this crazy situation. Like Sweden, you know, do you remember the old days? We all used to talk about Sweden, always a Scandinavian option for everything. Anything in life could be improved by referring to Scandinavia. People would say, oh, well, the Swedish this, the Danish that, whether it was a hot drink or a way to feel good or a policy. It was always about Scandinavia. And then, as you say, Rita, you know, you get this situation where you have now Sweden, the second largest number of any country not officially only after Mexico. Only after Mexico, people are completely stripped of their capabilities and their rights. When you allow, as I've seen this in Sweden myself, you know, big bearded guys in their 20s who say, oh, I'm a child migrant, you know, allowed into a school and so on, and they just lose control of everything. But, you know, that's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this.
How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that?
He admits to having more questions than answers.
Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this, because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far.
Murray clarifies that he is not opposed to immigration.
On the matter of the rate of immigration, let's just clear up something. Nobody on my side, I certainly am not against immigration, and that is not what the motion is about. And you can reinvent it however much you want, but that's not what it's about. It's that there has been too much. And I would say, like I think other speakers have already said, that too much did not happen in the 50s, or the 60s, or the 70s, or the 80s. It happened under the Labour government in the 1990s and the early 2000s. There is a motif that this country has always been a nation of immigrants. That is not true. It is not true. For most of this country's history, there was a very homogenous group of people on these islands. And the idea, the idea that what is happening now is what has always happened is simply a fib, and you have to look to this. The Huguenots are always given as an example, a very good example, and a group that 50,000 Huguenots came to this country in the period of the 1680s onwards. Now, 50,000 Huguenots over the period of years was equal to about 2 months of immigration in the 1990s. 50,000 was about 2 months. The Ugandan Asians expelled by Idi Amin, which this country, I think, rightly took in, numbered 30,000 people. 30,000 people by the late 1990s was 6 weeks of immigration. So my point to you, first of all, is that the speed and the rate matters, and it matters for a reason which I am going to come back to in a moment. But first, let me mention some of the arguments that have come up which do need answering about this.
He discusses the necessity of mass immigration for our society.
The first is the inevitable argument that the reason why we need mass immigration and have needed it is because there are jobs that British people will not do, and we need to import people to do those jobs. Let me say to you as frankly as it is possible to say, that is one of the most racist arguments you can hear. It suggests that there are jobs which British people not only don't want to do, but shouldn't do, don't have to do. We don't have to even encourage them to do, even need to encourage them to do. But we will go around the rest of the world and hoover up people who are willing to work for nothing because it provides us with cheap nannies and cheap waiters in restaurants and so on. I think it's a lamentable argument. The second argument you can hear, and we had it already tonight, is the argument about the hoovering up, as I would put it, of the other end, as it were, of the economic spectrum, that it is the best idea possible that we will travel around the world and hoover up nurses and doctors in Africa and across other regions of the world, that we can take people from the third world who the third world has superbly educated and make sure they benefit us. Again, I think a lamentable argument. Look, the argument on immigration often comes down to net benefits. Is it an economic net benefit or an economic problem? You can, incidentally, on the material on this, find pretty much a 50-50 divide. About 50% of the studies say that there's a huge impact positively for the country. About the other 50% say the opposite. And by the way, that even goes, Lord Singh, to the study you cited. You cited the UCL study. That same study found that between 1995 and 2011, migrants in the UK received £95 billion more in services and benefits than they contributed in taxes. That's the same study that you cited. Another one that we get told, and we got it from someone on the floor, we need immigrants because they're going to pay our pensions. Ladies and gentlemen, whoever the gentleman is, let me tell you something, a shocking fact. Immigrants get old as well. An amazing fact.
We must import more immigrants to meet our needs.
Which means that if you have that model, every single year you need to import more and more immigrants because you need to support that. It's known as the pyramid or migration model, and it doesn't work either. Look, one of the strange things about having this debate is this. Everyone thinks that they have to tiptoe. I'm sure you're nervous about walking through the proposition lobby tonight. I'm sure you are, because this is an issue which is fervid and fetid in all sorts of ways. But one of the oddities about this is that there is complete political unanimity on this side of the House. Complete political unanimity. Jack Straw, who was one of the Labour ministers who presided over that catastrophic period of too fast immigration, now says, he said it in November of last year, that it was a spectacular mistake. That's his words, a spectacular mistake. He will bring net immigration down because he realizes his party got this wrong. He said in September of last year, I want to get overall immigration down. David Cameron, Nadim's party leader, the man who would be properly Prime Minister, perhaps in 2015, said in his speech last year, on 25th of March, he said, contra, Nadim, to your argument, quote, under the previous government, immigration was far too high and the system was badly out of control. Net migration needs to come down radically. That's the words of the Prime Minister. This is not an outrider argument. It's what all the main political parties now say. They say it because it's what the public think. 77% of the people in the British Social Attitudes poll last year said they wanted immigration to come down. Almost 60% said they wanted it to come down by a lot. That's the British people's opinion, and the politicians are simply, amazingly, having to try to answer that, and a serious need. Now, I'm aware that the bell has gone, but let me very quickly address the issue, if I can find it, that came up from a couple of people.
Murray claims that we don't know who we are. It leads to the thing of we're not anything.
And this is the key thing I really wanted to mention, if I may have a moment. This issue of our values. I hate hearing this we don't know who we are, because quite often it leads to the thing of we're not anything. Britain isn't anything, Britain never existed, it's not an identity, and so on. One of the reasons you hear that is because it is an attempt, I think an honest and a decent attempt by people to answer a real question. When you have migration at the rate this country has had it in recent years, you have to expand and water down your definition of what you are, because you have people coming in so fast that what would have been your definitions of yourself stop holding. If you asked somebody 50 years ago, what is Britishness? What are British values? They would have said it very clearly. They are epitomised in a set of historic institutions, in the institutions of Parliament, in the institutions of trial by jury and the high courts, in the great schools and universities. They would have said the monarchy, they would have said the Church of England. Why is it now that we have this big, endless debate? Who are we? What are we? It's because we want to welcome people, but it's happened so fast, we have to end up doing things like saying Britishness is about fair play or being nice to people. Everyone wants to be nice to people. Very few people would say our identity as a country is being mean to people. But we water it down because it's what we think we have to do, and in a way we're right. In a way we're right. Because it has become very difficult to say what Britishness is or can be or should be for people when immigration happens at this kind of rate. I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, this is something which in your lifetime and mine is going to be a colossal issue. Migration does bring all sorts of benefits. When it comes at this sort of rate, I would argue it also brings some very negative things as well. And one of the things that is that people of this country, including many, many immigrants, and I'll finish on this, many immigrants, including first and second generation immigrants, now say, there is a problem with the speed of immigration because it changes the country. It is all very well to say that we are open to people who share our values. But if our values water down and the people who come here come at the rate they have, it is not surprising that we will end up arguing for immigration as an economic thing, because we will be giving up our culture, we will be giving up our identity, and we will be saying what some people now do say, which is that the peoples of Britain and Europe have lost their place in the world. I think it is right for people to have a place they call home, an identity that they're proud of. I think it for all people around the world, and I think it for the people of this country. And I hope tonight you can vote to say you think that too.
Over half a century ago. In just a 3-year period between 1969 and 1972, 12 humans on 6 separate missions literally walked on the moon.
Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The rehearsal is the final test needed before the launch of the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission around the moon.
The launch of the Soviet Sputnik satellite was a massive blow to America's space efforts. As if that was not enough, the Soviets also had the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. In response, NASA doubled its efforts, eventually launching the first men to the moon surface in 1969.
It has been 57 years since the first human ventured into space. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin made history at the age of 27 by completing a single orbit of Earth in approximately 108 minutes.
But beyond the celebration and national pride, an army of skeptics launched fiery attacks on NASA, claiming that the moon landing was all fake. Now, Jordan Peterson has come forward to separate facts from fiction. What is the argument of the moon landing skeptics, and what has been the response of space scientists? Join us as we examine the most controversial space exploration debate, early controversies on the moon landing. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong and fellow astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins.
Each of these men has had one flight before, and here they are as they left the Manned Space Center. Armstrong, and then I believe it's Collins and then Aldrin, isn't it?
That would very likely be the order.
Launched aboard the Saturn V rocket from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Saturn V was the most giant rocket ever flown and remains one of the most potent rockets made in history. Only China and Russia have been able to build rockets that may rival the Saturn V. As the countdown reached zero, the rocket engines ignited with immense power, launching the spacecraft and its crew into space. The moment Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins lifted off was streamed live before more than 500 million people worldwide. As the Eagle, the moon landing part of the Apollo 11 mission, touched down on the moon, Neil Armstrong became the first man in history to step on the moon as he made his giant leap for all humanity.
And today marks 55 years since mankind's first historic moon landing. And the San Diego Air and Space Museum held the only in-person celebration with the legends who were a part of the Apollo 11 mission earlier today.
But something shocking happened next, leaving the world in many debates, arguments, and fights for almost 60 years. It is a conspiracy. The historic launch, culminating in years of planning, engineering, and scientific effort, became a subject of public debate and controversies. It should also have been a source of unrivaled pride for the American people, who had just won the space race against the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a win for the United States, it was a win for everyone, our allies, friends, and all of humanity, regardless of their affinity. The moon landing showed the world that humans could travel to other worlds. Over the next few years, 6 more Apollo missions would land on the moon, the last being Apollo 17 in December 1972. Since then, no humans have walked on the moon again.
Apollo 17 in December of 1972. Astronauts Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt, the last men to walk on the moon, hammered cylinders into the lunar surface.
The fact that no other humans have landed on the moon has also raised many questions. Could NASA have faked the moon landing episode? We will come back to that, but before we do, it is essential to trace the origins of the conspiracy theory. It all started at the close of the Apollo programs in the early 1970s. As humanity achieved the incredible feat of landing astronauts on the lunar surface twice, skepticism and disbelief emerged alongside admiration and awe. There were a few reasons for this doubt. Back then, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a space race competition. So some people concluded that the United States made up the story to appear stronger than the Soviets. Also, rapid advancement in media technology allowed for more scrutiny and analysis of images and footage. Finally, landing on the moon seemed so impossible that some couldn't accept it was real. These doubts grew into full-blown conspiracy theories, with people saying the whole thing was a fake movie set up in some Hollywood studio on Earth.
The moon and space exploration are magnets for fake news. August 2022. A prominent French physicist discovers a star, later admits it was a piece of chorizo. July 1969. Man lands on the moon. Or didn't, according to conspiracy theorists.
These ideas are still around today, and they show how some people only sometimes trust what they're told, even about significant historical events. One of the most vocal voices on the moon landing debate is Joe Rogan.
Problem with the videos of people on the moon is that there are videos that look 100% fake.
But Rogan has also converted into a believer. Here are some of his old claims. Joe Rogan's earlier perspective on the moon landing. Rogan once launched scathing attacks on the photographic evidence provided by NASA to justify the moon landings. Like other conspirators, Rogan mentions no stars in any of the pictures. He believed that if the astronauts were on the moon, there would be many stars in every photo. But this needs to be corrected. The pictures were taken on the moon during the day when the sun is out. The moon's surface is super bright in the sunlight, just like a sunny day here on Earth. The stars are too faint to be seen in the photos next to all that brightness. Another big question raised by Rogan is about the little crosshairs you see in moon landing pictures. He believes these crosshairs are sometimes behind objects in the photos, which wouldn't be possible if the images were accurate. To him, this means the crosshairs must have been added later, like in a painting or Photoshop, but scientists have also debunked this.
50 years after the Apollo 11 mission, moon landing hoaxes and conspiracy theories still live on. While scientists and researchers continue to explain and defend the lunar landing's authenticity, some people are still convinced it never happened.
These crosshairs are faint markings on the camera lens itself. When the astronauts were taking pictures of bright objects like the moon's surface, the crosshairs would appear dimmer, and some details might be lost. This can sometimes make it look like the crosshairs are behind something in the picture, but it's just a trick of light and copying. Rogan also loves pointing to a weird mark on a rock in a photo from the Apollo 16 mission.
6 Apollo missions landed men on the moon.
This one right here? That's it. You got it right there.
Their astronauts turned geologists collected in all 842 pounds of lunar rock and soil, starting 50 years ago this month.
They say it looks like the letter C and proves the picture was faked, like a wrong movie prop. But when you look closely at the original photo, there's no C. It was probably just a hair or thread that got stuck when the picture was copied. Here's another interesting one. He claims the American flag planted on the moon by Armstrong and Aldrin looks like it's waving in the wind in some photos. There's no wind on the moon, so how could that be?
NASA was well aware that there's, of course, no wind on the moon. There's no way to naturally make it sort of fly as you'd expect.
Easy. The flag wasn't waving. It had a horizontal rod across it to keep it stiff and extended. This rod makes it look like the flag is blowing in the wind, but it's not. These are examples of how people can misunderstand things and develop conspiracy theories. Sometimes these conspirators don't know all the facts about NASA's technology or lack knowledge about how things work on the moon. However, some people raise technical questions about the moon landing. These are not pointing at some image, rough marks on the rock, or asking why a flag was waving. We are talking about critical physics and geography questions. The leading question in this regard is about Van Allen. Van Allen are giant zones around the Earth filled with solar super-energetic particles. Conspirators argue that astronauts would be killed by radiation flying through them. The truth is that Van Allen was one of the critical technical challenges that NASA faced while planning the missions. NASA scientists took steps to protect the astronauts from potentially deadly radiation levels. They used a special aluminum shield on the spacecraft to block radiation, like a suit of armor.
James Van Allen first found evidence of radiation at high altitudes near the poles with Raccoon launches in the early 1950s. Follow-up observations from instruments on board the Explorer 1 satellite in February of 1958 allowed him to discover the high radiation environment.
They also planned for the rockets to travel the shortest path to the moon. This means the astronauts will only spend a little time flying through the BET, significantly reducing their chances of getting caught in the web of radioactive plasma. Ultimately, the 9 moon landing missions showed NASA was right about radiation. The average astronaut's radiation dose was only 0.46 rad. While that's higher than some people who work with X-rays, it's much less than what some nuclear power plant workers deal with today. Sure, there will always be some things in the records that people might find strange and use to claim the moon landings were faked. That is precisely how conspiracy theories work. Find a small gap and hold on to it at all costs, even at the expense of common sense and credible evidence. The truth is that the sheer amount and detail of the evidence stand against these conspirators. There are over 8,400 pictures from the moon missions that anyone can see, countless hours of video footage, tons of scientific data, and complete recordings of all the conversations between the astronauts and mission control back on Earth. On top of that, the Apollo missions brought back 382 kilograms of moon rocks. Scientists from all over the world examined these rocks and confirmed they were definitely from the moon.
More than 840 pounds of samples were collected from the moon between 1969 and 1972. It's a collection of rocks, core samples, pebbles, and dust that scientists are still learning from nearly 50 years later.
The US can't fake all of that. But another critical question that conspirators ask is why the US government has not been to the moon since the 1970s. Stay tuned. We are about to reveal a decades-long secret, future lunar missions and technological advancements. We haven't returned to the moon since the early 1970s, mainly because of money. The space program is costly. When you consider inflation, the Apollo missions cost the US government about $260 billion. That's a lot of cash. Even though the Soviet Union launched the first satellite and sent the first person into space, they gave up on the moon race after the US first landed there. Apart from the fact that the Soviet Union was broke after spending much money building weapons and fighting proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, they lost their crucial space leader, Sergei Korolev. Korolev was the chief engineer and principal architect behind the Soviet space program. He played an essential role in developing the R-7 rocket, which launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite.
He designed and built the rockets that launched the first artificial satellite into space.
And Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. He was also instrumental in planning and executing many of the Soviet Union's early space achievements. Korolev died on January 14, 1966, following complications from surgery. His death was a significant blow to the Soviet space program, as he was a visionary leader and the driving force behind many of its successes. His passing contributed to the challenges the Soviet space program faced in the race to the moon, which ultimately saw the United States successfully land astronauts on the lunar surface with the Apollo program. Without him pushing for it, they stopped funding their moon program. Therefore, the United States figured there was little point in returning to the moon without competition, especially since there was no way to make money from it. Even though lots of people liked the idea of exploring space, the moon mission seemed too expensive to many NASA administrators. What we will reveal will thrill all space lovers. The United States announced plans to return to the moon in 2017. NASA has been preparing to send the first woman and the next man to the moon this year, although it now appears the program will be delayed again. This mission aims to surpass previous lunar landings. However, it may happen differently than planned. For instance, the Constellation program aimed to return humans to the moon was well underway in the 2000s, but was cancelled by Obama in 2010 due to high costs. We might have already returned to the moon if not for its cancellation. So, why does it take so long and cost so much to prepare for missions like Constellation and Artemis when we already went to the moon in the 1960s and 1970s? We are nearer to going back to the moon than you notice. Recently, an unmanned American moonlander named Odysseus landed on the moon for the first time since the 1970s.
We've just received confirmation that Odysseus, this little spacecraft, has landed on the lunar surface.
This spacecraft was built by a company in Houston called Intuitive Machine. To give you an idea of how costly moon exploration is, Odysseus is part of a program that cost NASA $118 billion. This is the first time a private company has landed a craft on the moon, and it is a stepping stone to sending people back there soon. NASA now says we can expect American astronauts to walk on the moon again as early as September 2026. This program is called Artemis, and it will be extra special because it will include the first woman, the first black person, and the first Canadian astronaut to ever leave footprints on the moon. Some people suggested that NASA lost the old technologies and research for the old moon landings, but this is a lie. The space chief under President Trump, Jim Bridenstine, says getting back to the moon isn't a science problem. We have the brains and the technology to do it. According to Bridenstine, it all comes down to politics. Leaders worry that moon missions are too risky and too expensive. He says we'd already be walking on Mars if it weren't for these concerns. We are about to reveal another attractive NASA space plan, a lunar space station and NASA budget problems. It is also important to mention that NASA and other space scientists have been seeking to build a moon colony for a long time. It would be like a space station, but on the moon. A former astronaut named Chris Hadfield says this is a significant next step because it's only a 3-day trip from Earth. Even if they encounter problems, going farther out in space would be less dangerous. Plus, setting up a moon colony would help us learn new things and invent new tools to explore space even more. A moon base may also serve as a service station in space for rockets heading out to explore even further. We could also build giant telescopes on the moon to let us see things in space like never before. A moon base would also be a great training ground for astronauts who want to go to Mars someday. Also, it might help us answer some ancient mysteries about how the Earth and Moon formed. There could even be moon hotels for space tourists one day. As mentioned earlier, whether landing astronauts on the moon or building a lunar station, the biggest problem holding us back is the high cost. Even though NASA's budget is over $25 billion this year, that money has to cover many things, like telescopes, giant rockets, and research on other planets, asteroids, and even the edge of our solar system. That means there is only sometimes enough cash to send people back to the moon or build a lunar station. To make matters worse, approving NASA's budget can take time and effort. Delays in passing the 2024 budget caused NASA to lay off workers at a significant space center. NASA's budget has also shrunk compared to its glory days. An astronaut who flew on Apollo 7 pointed out that NASA's portion of the federal budget was 4 times bigger in 1965. A recent NASA report says their Artemis program to put people back on the moon will cost around $93 billion by 2025. That's a lot of money. For comparison, the Apollo missions in today's dollars would have cost about $257 billion. As an astronaut once said, sending people to space is super expensive, making it challenging to get approval from politicians. An astronaut put it bluntly, unless Congress gives NASA more money, all this talk about going back to the moon and Mars is just a dream. He said NASA's budget simply needs to be more significant to handle everything they've talked about doing. Recently, many other countries have also been trying to break the record. Who will be the next to land astronauts on the moon? If you think America will land the next human before front-runners like China and India, send your views in the comment section before we continue. There's a lot of exciting facts just ahead. Russia, China, and India in the race for the moon. Russia, China, and India are in a tight race to reach the moon, all coming behind the United States.
Also tonight, Russia staking its claim in a new space race to the moon and Mars. A Russian probe expected to land on the moon's south pole any day now in an area that could be critical for the future of exploration beyond the moon.
For instance, China launched a robotic mission to the moon just last year. This uncrewed mission, called Chang'e 6, is China's most advanced space mission yet, and it did something extraordinary. Brought back rocks from the far side of the moon.
China's Chang'e 6 lunar probe's on its way back to Earth after collecting rock and soil samples from the far side of the moon. China's National Space Agency confirmed the uncrewed spacecraft lifted off from the moon's surface.
Something they have never tried before. The launch was a success, blasting off from a rocket center on Hainan Island with many space enthusiasts cheering it on. This mission is a stepping stone for China's ambitious space plans. They want to land astronauts on the moon by 2030 and even build a moon base. Everyone now sees the moon as a valuable resource for science and other space research. China's mission lasted about 53 days. That's not all. Their lander touched down in a giant crater on the moon's far side, a spot that never faces Earth. Before that, China was the first country to land on the moon's far side in 2019 with its Chang'e 4 mission.
For China, it became the first country ever to put a probe on that far side, or the dark side of the moon, as it approached and touched down.
The Indians have not been left out of the race. India landed on the moon's south pole on August 23, 2023. This is a big deal for two reasons. First, it's the first time any country has ever explored this part of the moon. The South Pole is covered in craters, valleys, and even old ice. Second, India is the first country to land on the moon since China in 2020. This moon landing race is heating up. Several countries, including the United States, are setting their sights on the moon with their Artemis program. Everyone is curious about what secrets it holds. Russia also launched a probe to the moon last year, although it ended in tragedy. The Luna 25 blasted off in August and reached the moon's orbit a few days later. Unfortunately, something went wrong with the engines when they tried to get closer to the moon's surface. They fired for too long and ended up crashing instead of landing softly. Even though the landing wasn't successful, Putin said they would not give up on space exploration. Russia has already announced plans for more missions. Their Luna 26 is scheduled for launch in 2027, followed by Luna 27 in 2028. They might even send Luna 28 by 2030. These missions could be part of a giant moon research station built with China by the mid-2030s. It would be amazing to learn more about the moon. The new space race is here, and the critical question is, who will be the next country to land humans on the moon? Thank you for staying with us. What do you think about the lunar landing conspiracy theories? Should the government allocate more funds to NASA? Let's have your opinions in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen, and you will enjoy it.